The old houses of Okayama Prefecture whisper secrets, but none so chilling as the one reflected in a mother's empty gaze. What if the face you trusted most became a mirror to your deepest fears? The bus ride to rural Okayama was a journey back, in time for Kenji. He hadn't visited his ailing grandmother in years, and the sprawling, now decaying farmlands felt alien compared to his Tokyo life. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, a faint metallic tang he couldn't quite place. His grandmother, Obasan Yuki, was frail, her eyes clouded. But it was the other women in the village, particularly the mothers, who first pricked his unease. He noticed it at the small grocery store. Mrs. Tanaka, a woman he remembered for her boisterous laughter, now moved with a quiet, almost gliding gait. Her face, usually so expressive, seemed smooth, too smooth. Her eyes, when they briefly met his, didn't seem to focus, reflecting the dim store lights with an unnatural clarity, like polished glass. Kenji dismissed it as a trick of the light, or perhaps the somber mood of a community struggling with decline. Young people had long since fled for the cities, leaving behind an aging population and fields slowly being reclaimed by nature. Yet, the unsettling feeling lingered. He saw it again in Mrs. Sato, who tended the small, withered shrine at the edge of the village. Her face, too, possessed that strange, reflective quality, her expressions muted, almost non-existent. It was as if a delicate, invisible film had been stretched over their features, blurring the familiar lines of age and emotion. He asked Obasan Yuki about it, but she just hummed, a distant look in her own clouded eyes, muttering about the reflections and the old ways. The nights were the worst. The cicada song was sometimes pierced by a subtle, high-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate in his teeth. He'd find himself staring at his own reflection in the darkened window panes, half expecting to see that same glassy sheen on his own skin. He started noticing a pattern. Only women who were mothers, or had been mothers, seemed to carry this. Change. Young women, childless women, and all the men remained untouched, their faces etched with normal worry and weariness. The affected mothers, however, were becoming more alike each day. Their skin took on a porcelain-like smoothness, their eyes becoming perfect, unblinking orbs that mirrored everything with unnerving precision. They moved with a quiet, eerie grace, their routines undisturbed, yet utterly devoid of their former warmth. Kenji felt a primal fear begin to coil in his stomach. This was not illness, not as he understood it. This was a creeping transformation, silent and inexorable. The village was steeped in an oppressive atmosphere, a sense of quiet dread. That was becoming harder to ignore. The change accelerated. Within a week, nearly every mother in Kenji's small hamlet of Okayama bore the glass face. Their skin was no longer skin, but a translucent, perfectly smooth surface, like sculpted crystal. Their eyes were devoid of pupils, simply reflecting the world before them in miniature, sharp and distorted. Conversations with them became exercises in terror. Their voices, when they spoke, were monotone, detached, as if relayed from a great distance. When Kenji tried to speak to Mrs. Tanaka about her son who lived in Osaka, her glass face merely reflected his own terrified expression back at him. There was no recognition, no maternal warmth, only that perfect, horrifying mirror. The remaining villagers, the men and the childless women, were consumed by a creeping panic. Some tried to flee, but stories returned of cars breaking down on the only road out, or of an invisible barrier that turned them back, their minds muddled and confused. The outside world seemed to have forgotten them. Phone lines crackled with static. The internet was a distant memory. They were isolated, trapped with these serene, glassy figures who were once their wives, their mothers, their neighbors. Kenji found an old leather-bound journal in Obasan Yuki's belongings. It spoke of a local legend, a Kagami no Haha, a mirror mother, a spirit that would appear in times of great neglect, when the balance between the village and the unseen world was disturbed. It was said the spirit would claim the faces of mothers to reflect the community's own emptiness. Back at itself, a horrifying, silent judgment, the horror became more active. The glass-faced mothers began to gather at dusk in the central, overgrown rice paddy, their forms almost invisible against the setting sun, save for the glint of light on their crystalline features. They would stand there for hours, motionless, their heads sometimes tilting in unison as if listening to a sound Kenji couldn't hear. One evening, old Mr. Ito, desperate to see his wife's true face again, approached the group pleading. As he reached out, his hand passed through Mrs. Ito's glassy arm as if it were mist. He recoiled, screaming, his sanity shattering. The reflected image of his terrified face on her impassive visage was the last thing he saw clearly. The abyss wasn't just looking back, it was showing them their own souls, stripped bare and reflected in an emotionless, perfect surface. Kenji realized this wasn't about a virus or a physical ailment. It was something far older, far more fundamental, a horror woven into the very fabric of this decaying land. The final stage was subtle, yet infinitely more terrifying. The glass-faced mothers began to reflect more than just their surroundings. Peering into Mrs. Sato's face, Kenji saw not his own reflection, but a distorted, nightmarish landscape of swirling, abstract shapes and impossible geometries, something that hinted at a vast, uncaring cosmos. The reflections were no longer passive. They were windows into an alien dimension, a place of pure, unadulterated dread. The men and unaffected women in the village started to avoid looking at them, covering their own eyes, but the psychic pressure was immense. Sleep offered no escape. Only dreams filled with smooth, reflective surfaces and the faint, metallic hum. Obasan Yuki was one of the last to fully change. Kenji watched, helpless, as the last vestiges of her familiar expressions were wiped away, replaced by that impenetrable, crystalline sheen. When he looked at her, he saw his own despair mirrored, but behind it, the swirling chaos. He tried to break one of the faces, hoping to see what lay beneath, picking up a heavy farming tool and swinging it at a mother who stood silently by the well. The tool passed through her as if she were an illusion, the only sound the clang as it struck the stone well behind her. There was no shattering, no resistance, nothing. They were untouchable, ethereal, yet their presence was an unbearable weight. There was no fight left. The remaining unaffected villagers descended into a catatonic state, huddled in their homes, afraid to look, afraid to live. Kenji knew there was no escape from Okayama, no rescue coming. The horror was absolute. Not an attack, but a presence, a state of being that had enveloped them. He found himself drawn to the window, looking at his own reflection, searching for the first signs of smoothness, the first unnatural glint. The terror was no longer about what was happening to the mothers, but the dawning realization that their fate was a mirror for all. The silence of the village was broken only by the incessant chirping of cicadas and the almost inaudible hum that seemed to emanate from the glass faces themselves, a sound that promised an eternity of clear, cold, unfeeling reflection. The world outside this small pocket of Okayama would never know. The fields would continue to decay, and the glass-faced mothers would stand as silent, eternal sentinels, their faces reflecting a horror that had no name and no end.